There was a time back then when, before Canada could make wine, and it's like you could just walk through an Emily Carr painting and see the honorable hewers of wood and drawers of water, those lonely and courageous folks at the rugged shores of North America's expanse. Lauren Harris with his cartoon mountain dancing in the sunshine, the folk singer greats lamenting about loss and cold and the icy relentlessness. This is the Great White North stuff, the Milne painting of the Snowy Valley, the Morisseau and the Woodlands School, or way back to the Craigoff with the kids playing hockey on the pond. But wait, let's give our heads a shake, because that's not really what's going on. Really, Canada is an oil extraction giant, villain, one of the worst CO2 emitters in the world, and a huge part of our whole civilization is funded directly from the nature-destroying extraction industries. There's a story here. Before we get too buried in the cynicism and hypocrisy, let's take a look at the sharp tension between what Canadian opinion is about the environment and the reality that we have at the economic activity level. Perhaps extending from this nature-loving identity myth, of course, we have the surveys that overwhelmingly Canadians believe in climate action and fossil fuel transition, but yet our country continues to actually worsen its emissions performance, way out of step with the rest of the world. I'm Paul Burns, and this is Climate Action Matters. We're a fact-based discussion about climate change and Canada's transition from fossil fuels. We put people in touch with good information and point to the best ways of getting involved. Today, we'll talk about Canada's public opinion on climate and the gap between public opinion and public policy. How there are opportunities for advocacy and supporting Canada's transition from fossil fuels. Well, let's do some work and take a look. Susan Crean's piece back in 1976, Who's Afraid of Canadian Culture, was really put together when people had their doubts about whether or not Canadian identity was really a coherent anything, if it had existed or would ever amount to anything at all. Well, maybe it was a bit elusive at the time to think of a unique sustaining set of cultural values across a big diverse place called Canada. We know better today because of things like fine art, music, and novels, and well, because of opinions we have together about our experience and outlook. Crean's book forces the conversation a layer deeper on this point. Maybe about the aspirations about where we live and what we do. On the topic of climate and fossil fuels, for example, do Canadians have a particular public opinion outlook? A look at public opinion survey information can get us a pretty good picture. The data on this comes from a piece called What Do Canadians Think About Climate Change from Clean Climate. This is consistent with a long string of opinion polls that show support for the government addressing climate change and investing in the environment. The data is available in the link below. The surveys show a very large majority of Canadians are seriously worried about climate change. That's over 75%. 3/4 of us are by now making the connection between extreme weather and global warming. The public is also now broadly convinced that energy transition is inevitable. That's 71%. And highly supportive of shifting to clean energy. That's 81%. In the area of carbon pricing, most Canadians support it. Over 70% support carbon pricing. And for electric cars, majority of Canadians, over 70%, support federal incentives for EVs. As far as grants for refitting homes and buildings, and the federal government recently announced a boost to green buildings. According to the research, Canadians overwhelmingly understand that energy transition is a global phenomenon, not something we only think about in Canada. 3/4 of Canadians believe it will benefit in the long term, and 70% say it's necessary whether we like it or not. These results hold that even over 59% think it will make life more expensive. And even further on the point, when polling results range from 42% to 57% saying that government is not doing enough to spur a clean energy economy or combat climate change. One of the results of the analysis pieces is that there's a serious gap between the level of concern and the level of demand for action. You see how this puts us in a risky position when we are all in the business of connecting actual public opinion to actual public policy. Well, what's going on with that big difference between what Canadians want and what's really happening? In the face of the opinions, why are governments still allowing growth in fossil fuel extraction? Someone named Paul Burstein, University of Washington, talks about this in his piece, The Impact of Public Opinion on Public Policy. This was an extensive piece that reviewed over 30 different studies to try and understand the link between policy and opinion and answers questions like, does public opinion actually impact on policy? And what's the role of special interests? The review included the work of developing a set of coefficients and an index to look at findings from different studies. And the team also looked at factors like how important certain issues were to people and the role of the media and special interest groups. Surprisingly, the conclusions are that public opinion was the strongest of the influences for policy change. The relative amount of influence was affected by how important or salient the issue was to the public. The impact of special interests was varied and perhaps influenced by the priority of the issue in the minds of the public. The record is not one about peace, order, and good government in Canada when it comes to our record on extractions. There's a price to be paid in natural resources-based set of economies. From fisheries, the coal to timber, waterways, and mines, the very roots of economies across Canada are all about extraction. So the record for how it impacts on the environment is probably best described as mediocre to maybe disastrous. Sometimes economic activity can be way out of step with public opinion, and there's a struggle. There's demonstrations and sit-ins, and finally a shift in public policy. Well, it would not be so easy in the case of big oil. Canada's oil and gas sector is the largest single emitter of greenhouse gases, accounting for 26% of emissions. And even that is not the whole story because it does not account for Scope 3 emissions, where the exported fuels are actually burned. The bottom line is that there are billions and billions in oil extraction activities happening in Canada, and there's extensive investment in campaigns to continue oil extraction activities, such as Jason Kenney's Energy War Room. Seriously, a war room? These are designed to continue to allow permits for extraction activities and to grow those extractions in the coming years. There's a bottom line here. Surveys show that we want emissions in Canada to go down. Actually, they're going up, and the current plans are to have them continue to go up. Surveys also show that we want to aspire to have better performance and leadership than other OECD neighbors. Actually, the opposite is happening. The majority of Canadians want measures to either slow down or cancel oil exploration. Actually, under the current measures in the Canada Energy Announcement, the opposite is happening. There are more exploration and expanded productions being planned. In light of the research and prior examples, it would be overly simplistic to say that we are ultimately and forever subject to the interests of big business, even if that's against our more deeply held identities and public opinion. Face it, we're not just hewers of wood and drawers of oil to help some billionaires sell oil and exceed our carbon budgets around the world. It might be a bit dramatic, but it's not too much to expect that public policy reflects public opinion, and that especially on these things that matter to us most. The obvious question is, what would it take for policy to move in the right direction on this? If we look to the past, then the answer may be something to do with continued, sustained, strong, active public opinion. It's not easy. There's work to do, and it's up to us constituents. Today, we talked about Canadian public opinion and discussed the gap between opinions and policy as it relates to the climate. we leave with the question, how does it work when the battle for public opinion is over and climate won, and the pressure to meet international targets is stated, and we are still beholden to the policy apparatus that is leading us to continue to increase emissions? Can we see this as an indication that there's room to expect the policy shift away from the interests of fossil fuels? Expect the policy shift toward public opinion. It's inevitable, and it's urgent, and it's already taking too long. Get angry, talk about it with your friends, vote, write letters, turn down the heat. Also, go to the demos, call the radio shows, help make it normal to talk about climate change. As usual, the footnotes and the links are in the below. Please press the subscribe button so you can see more of these videos, and use the bell so you can get reminders when new videos are available. And we'll see you next time on Climate Action Matters.